It's not often you get to hear firsthand lessons from someone who worked at or with a company that ultimately failed. This is one of those times. How? Well, an internal hire to a company typically won't care much about a failure beyond whether or not they can get the next job they're just as or more happy with. And so, as you'd expect, they move on quite quickly. And founders themselves don't want to talk about these things because they want to focus on the next thing they're building. What you're about to watch or listen to here today is different, because I'm not brought in as an internal hire who doesn't care or doesn't have skin in the game. I'm someone who's brought into companies at every stage, doing exceptionally well and not so much as an advisor. And regardless of what stage I'm brought in at, although specific things we do focus on change, we're there with the objective of making things work as well as they possibly can. So, here are 6 lessons I've learned from a failing startup, or 6 things you should avoid at all costs if you can. You can recycle these points into different learnings in a few different ways. I'll leave that up to you. Also, a quick side note, we don't mention specific people or company names out of respect for them and their future. But without further ado, let's dive in. Starting off with number 1, we have founders playing CEO too early. Some people chalk this up to being a first-time founder, but I think this does a disservice to all of the first-time founders who don't do this and do incredibly well. But first, let me break down what I mean by playing CEO. The telltale signs here are wanting to delegate themselves from core processes like hiring or running interviews before the first 10 hires, and attempting to delegate their own vision, responsibility, and ownership onwards. Basically, things that may start to make sense in an established organization, but are completely out of place in a startup. There are things that founders need to take part in, and ones with a chance of being successful won't even want to get out of doing in the early stages of their startup. This is something I've always struggled to understand. Although I'm not a CEO or founder coach, it is where I almost need to act as though I am one for the companies we work with. Catching founders thinking like this makes me want to meet the founder in person to break past that barrier of them wanting to prematurely let go of things, to make them understand that it is ultimately their company and they need to care about things more than other people do, because the team isn't at the point where there are n number of A players around them that they can just rely on to pick up where they left off. And even if there were, often the where they left off is too vague and ambiguous for even the world's best player to come in and just figure it out from there. It's also times like these that make me feel I'm more invested, despite not being financially, in the success of the companies we work with than the founders themselves are. As you can probably imagine, when you work closely with founders, and you can probably hear in my voice, this is incredibly frustrating to witness. But to somewhat let off the founders that do this, I think it is something that is easier to witness from the outside and notice something's off about it than when you're internal. Even if you're a co-founder or a C-level hire that's joined the business, you probably won't notice the actual impact that this is having. Another example is that they just let their virtual assistant, who has no idea what their tech stack is, start interviewing engineers. Which, I mean, quite obviously isn't how you run interviews for technical positions at a startup. You need to have a technical background to run interviews. And if that's the founder, they need to do it themselves, at least for the first few hires. And if they're a non-technical founder, they need to work closely with a recruiter that can fill that expertise gap for them for the first 20 to 30 hires at the very least. As with all of the examples and points that I'm going to go through in this list, each of them can manifest in quite different ways at different companies. So in this particular company that I'm thinking of and that I'm using as an example, I'm giving examples of how those things have played out and how they've manifested. But a CEO playing CEO in a different startup that is a telltale sign of failure could manifest in a slightly different way. I'm always all ears for stories like this, so if you're curious to share, feel free to land in my inbox, alex@scalemath.com, or drop a comment if you can. But I'd understand why you can't publicly comment on a YouTube video with your own profile. Next off, we have number 2, raising money on a product that hasn't reached maturity. This is a classic one. I've seen founders rush to raise capital on what is essentially a minimum viable product, thinking that they can figure out the details later. But when you raise money early, you're not just making assumptions based on data because you don't have any data to base it on. You're making empty promises to investors. Every time I've watched a company raise money at these stages, be it internally or as a spectator from the outside, the end result was that they burned through capital trying to scale something that simply wasn't ready to scale, all while early users who were ready to iterate on that MVP with them were becoming increasingly frustrated with the team's messed up priorities. Because when you raise money, your priorities shift from serving your early users to doing things that are completely misaligned with ultimately building a fundamentally good product. Of course, as with everything, there are exceptions to this. And this example I'm referring to perhaps mostly applies to B2B SaaS products. If you're building the next Uber or have a big, audacious idea, that is, of course, different. Unless you think you've got the next Airbnb on your hands, the right approach is simple. Bear in mind, simple does not equate to easy. Get your product to a point where you're confident in its core functionality. Have real users who are genuinely getting value from it. Understand your product's economics. Then, and only then, think about raising money to pour fuel on the fire. Moving on, we have number 3. A team that has no appreciation for craftsmanship, led by a CEO who equally didn't get why it mattered. This is particularly painful to watch unfold. When a team doesn't care about quality, whether it's in engineering, design, or customer service, it shows up everywhere. I've seen teams ship features that were barely tested, with interfaces that look like they may as well have been designed in Microsoft Paint, all because they needed to move fast. But here's what they missed. Craftsmanship isn't about perfection. It's about caring deeply about the details that matter to your users. To users of the product I'm thinking about, this right here might be what the majority put down as the nail in the coffin. They'd regularly push updates that broke existing features or release new features that were so far from polished that they were practically unusable, simply because they, and largely the CEO, wanted to consider the development sprint over so that they could just start the next one already. Oftentimes justifying it with the fact that our users will tell us if something is wrong and we can always fix things on the fly. This is, however, not agile. This is purely lazy. And this led to the product developing a public perception of being unreliable, with many longtime users, including ones that had been grandfathered in on licenses from lifetime deals, moving on to look at other solutions. The most frustrating part was watching the CEO brush off these concerns because they needed to focus on growth. But you can't grow sustainably on a foundation of poor quality. Users do notice. They might not always tell you directly, but they vote with their feet. And even with the best growth team by your side, ScaleMath, you realistically can't save a cruise ship from sinking when it has a massive hole in it. Number 4, a premature focus on processes. Building systems before you do things on a small scale with extreme attention to detail. This is what I sometimes refer to as the process trap. Instead of focus on doing exceptional work, they try to systemizing work before it quote-unquote works. For example, let me paint the picture. Let's build an automated system to contact users we're onboarding and try to convert them. Meanwhile, they were getting 2 to 3 qualified new users per week, despite thousands of signups every week. And instead of just filtering to just manually contact those 2 to 3 qualified signups, they would trap themselves into thinking they needed to automate the hell out of something if they were going to do it at all. The sad part here is that they could have spent that time doing high-touch, manual onboarding to really understand their customers. Instead, they built a system based on assumptions, which never ended up working, unsurprisingly. Ultimately, blaming the system that was put in place for not working, not the fact that those 2 to 3 qualified users trying out their product simply didn't want to be hit with a garbage sales email from an alternate domain that looks like it could have been a spam email. The key is not only to start manual, but also to stay manual longer than you're comfortable with and only build out those extremely scalable automated processes once you're absolutely certain about what works. Do things that don't scale until it physically hurts, the typical Paul Graham advice, because that's when you know you're truly ready to build systems. Number 5, disrespecting the customer internally. Calling them stupid, treating the customer as idiots. This one really irks me because it's often subtle and creeps in over time, especially as you hire people without actually vetting for culture personally. It starts with small comments in internal meetings where people say things like, these users just don't get it or they're using it wrong. And then it evolves into making decisions without customer input because we know better. I witnessed one startup's leadership team consistently dismiss customer feedback as edge cases or not our target market. And they'd rationalize poor retention by saying users just weren't sophisticated enough and they weren't part of the target market, when in reality, they had just created an echo chamber where they'd convinced themselves they knew better than their own customers. Customers that were at one point paying them and voted with their feet over time as they realized that the company didn't truly value their business. The truth is, if your customers are consistently using it wrong or not getting it, that's not a customer problem. That's a product problem. And if you're not treating qualitative customer feedback as gold, you're setting yourself up for failure. This attitude seeps into every aspect of the business. I've watched it happen, from product development to customer support to marketing. Once you start disrespecting your customers internally, it's really only a matter of time before it shows in your external interactions. And last but not least, we have one which I would probably point to as being the worst of all, but I'd say on the list of ones we've covered in this video, they're all relatively equal. So number 6 is boiling down everything to numbers. There are more than 1 to 2 things at play that affect a number like churn. Trying to suggest that you can do 5 things and decrease churn by the end of the week, and it was only dependent on those 5 things being done, is perhaps one of the most dangerous oversimplifications I've seen. Teams get obsessed with metrics to the point where they lose sight of the complex reality behind those numbers. I've watched founders confidently declare, if we just do these 5 things this week, we'll be able to reduce churn by X%. As if customer retention was some simple mathematical equation. But startups aren't quite that simple. You just don't have the scale required for it to be nothing more than a numbers game, at least not yet. One example of this playing out in this scenario was the CEO spotting that churn spiked, immediately creating a company-wide priority of reducing churn, with specific numerical targets. Implementing rapid-fire changes left, right, and center, tweaking the onboarding flow, sending dozens of extra email reminders, preventing customers from canceling in the product's interface, you name it. All in the span of 2 weeks. Yet, somewhat comically, when the numbers didn't magically improve, they were baffled. Instead of trying to take a step back and think for a moment about the root cause for said churn being things like the product being practically unusable and unreliable due to the quality standard they had set for their engineering team, they just tried to do stuff. The reality is that metrics are nothing more than indicators. Listen to that again. Metrics are nothing more than indicators. They are not levers you can just pull for instant results. When you treat complex business challenges like simple mathematical equations, you end up with superficial solutions that don't address root causes. It's like trying to fix a car's engine by just looking at the dashboard warning lights. Yes, the lights tell you that something is wrong, but you need to get under the hood and understand the whole system to actually solve the problem. And above all, you need to be ready to get your hands dirty. This mindset of oversimplification often leads to band-aid solutions instead of meaningful improvement. And worse, it creates a culture where people start gaming the metrics rather than solving real problems for customers. Looking for input from a team that's worked with category-leading companies, possibly just like yours? We're here and ready to help. Please always feel free to land in my inbox anytime. I'm reachable at alex@scalemath.com. And if you enjoyed this as much as I did, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.